What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds each and every single day for the past 100 days, going up to 365. So, in today's video, we're going to be going through how I'm thinking of different tech stacks in terms of building true competitive advantage through that, and not just copying tools. So, basically, off the shelf tools and copying what everyone else is doing. We're going to be going through answering the question of why, if everyone is using the same tools, how are you then able to carve out leverage, or what is the edge that you're ultimately able to then build if everyone else is using the same tech stack, and also mapping the stack and basically the advantages that ultimately come as a result of that, and diving deep into the different layers that ultimately play a role in terms of mapping out your specific tech stack that is unique to your business needs, and also how it well ties in together, basically how this overall fits into the main mission for your specific business and how it is tailored to your needs as well, and also answering the question of where does the advantage actually lie. So if we go into the beginning and we just basically look at, hey, if everyone is using the same tools, how are you then able to find your edge? We can see this through seeing how most businesses are ultimately copying somewhat of the same SaaS stacks, basically using Slack, Airtable, Zapier, Notion, HubSpot, etc. But these tools alone don't create competitive advantage, they're more so a commodity. And what this ultimately means is that if every single person, my personal belief is that if every single person is using the same stack and you're in the same industry, how are you then able to carve out the advantage? What is the USP or your unique selling point, as well as your IP that is specific to your business, that ultimately creates that advantage that lets you, crush the competition? And I think in as much as you can build around the same tools, there needs to be a hidden leverage point within that ultimately allows you to scale a lot further than the competition. And that is where the problem is, basically seeing that this is a blind spot where companies are seeing this not at a systems thinking level, but ultimately at a level of thinking of the tools that they're using, asking the question of, hey, what tool can we actively use, and not looking at it from a system level thinking that ultimately focuses on turning these tools into leverage, and basically asking the question of what is the specific leverage, or what is the overarching goal that we want to hit, and how does the tools that we're using ultimately play as a factor towards reaching that main goal. And I think that is one of the most important questions to start off with, to ask yourself, what is the main goal that we're ultimately striving for? If everyone is using the same tech stack and the same tools, how are we then going to be able to create leverage that ultimately gets us ahead, which ultimately moves into the next point, which is mapping out the stack and also mapping out the advantage, which I believe is one of the most important things. And this is how I'm actively thinking about this in different layers of saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're mapping out the stack before we are then able to map out the advantage, because in as much as everyone may be doing the same thing, we need to go a step further in terms of asking the questions from first principles of what are the requirements that we need in order to build our business infrastructure, and through that is ultimately what's going to get us to the next stage as well. And that ultimately starts by saying, hey, what is the business plus future vision of our business? What is the future business that we're, or future vision that we ultimately have for the business? Which ultimately means that we need to make sure that we're understanding the unique workflows, bottlenecks, and growth trajectories for the business first. So for example, if we're going to be scaling to 100,000 people on this specific system, then we cannot use specific tools that ultimately cannot handle that level of volume. And we also need to make sure that if we're then going to use a tool for the beginning stages, then we also need to make sure that we're mapping out a roadmap as well, or a specific workflow that allows us to have a smooth transition. Because I think one of the most important things of everything is 80% preparation and then 20% execution, in the sense that every single thing comes as a result of the preparation of how you're building out your stack, and also mapping mapping out your advantage. And this ultimately means that we need to make sure that we're focusing on the unique workflows. So for example, if we have a business that ultimately runs in the education space, we need to make sure that, hey, are we actively sending out emails when we need to? And our unique workflow is going to be where our specific competitive advantage is going to lie. So we need to make sure that we're understanding this from a first principles basis, and also understanding the bottlenecks, because the bottlenecks are definitely going to come, the constraints are definitely going to come. And you know what I always said, in the past or the first 100 videos, that you only move as fast as your constraints, meaning that you need to be able to identify the bottlenecks within your specific business. And that ultimately means, or it comes as a result of mapping out, because if you're then able to have a master doc, for example, that has a mapped out vision for your current business stacks, and also how that plays into the business vision as well, then you're then able to see the growth trajectory and also understand what type of bottlenecks you would have into the future. But it all comes as a result of asking those questions, my personal belief, because questions allow you to dig a lot deeper in terms of how things actually work, and also understanding your business first. Because if you don't understand your business first at its current present moment in time, then how are you going to understand it as it grows and matures? Because your business is ultimately going to be a result of compounding things that happen from the beginning. And how do you actively ask the questions, or ask the right questions, that lead it to have a positive compounding effect, so that when you hit 100,000 users or 100,000 people that are processing payments or just using your platform, then you're able to then combat that with the specific tech stack that you were able to map out. Because say, hey, for example, let's say you're using what everyone else is using, but ultimately as a result of that, you cap out at 20,000 users, and then you're gonna have to migrate to a different software. But if you don't map out that migration process as well, in terms of understanding that, hey, this specific tool that we're using is not going to natively integrate in terms of the one that we need to use when we're then scaling further, then we're ultimately going to have a problem. And that's going to cost a lot of money, because then you're going to have to connect different tools, or you're going to have to do an entire data scraping process or migration process, where you ultimately move your entire database, and that requires a lot of maneuvering and is also a very costly thing to do. So then you're going to be, as a result, if you don't want to go through that extra route, you're going to have to do patchwork. For example, like let's say you want to make sure that your data from Google Sheets now is migrated into Airtable, but there's a problem in that specific step that you can't natively integrate it, although you can. You ultimately need to find a third-party solution that fits in the middle, and say that third-party solution that fits in the middle is not native to either Airtable or Google Sheets. Then you're going to have a problem where you're going to have to connect different tools, and then complexity increases as a result of that. And through that, it ultimately comes as a result of first understanding what is the business plus the future vision of this business, and then mapping out the second layer, or then moving on to the next step, which is ultimately the tool selection, which is fit for the purpose. So this basically means that you picking the right tools, like I mentioned, that are aligned with the system, and not just what everyone else uses. So like I said in that example, if your goal is to hit 100,000 users, but that specific tech stack that everyone else uses caps out at 20, then you're ultimately gonna have a problem, because then you're gonna have to migrate, which ultimately is gonna be a very costly manner. So it ultimately comes as a result of fully understanding your business, and then mapping out the tools that you ultimately need for that purpose, so fit for purpose. And then through that, you're then able to integrate, which is one of the most important layers, which is the flow of work. And this ultimately means that you're building these different tools, and you're connecting them to optimize the specific processes that you do have, and avoiding silos as well, because you need to make sure that the tools that you're picking in the tool selection process are then able to natively talk or communicate with each other, and they don't work in silos, in the sense that they work standalone. In example, that this tool does not connect with all the other tools that are important to your business functions on a day-to-day basis. And that ultimately comes as a result from this mapping out process, where you need to make sure that, hey, you're asking the questions, does this natively integrate with the apps that you need for your specific use case? And if it doesn't, is there another way that we can ultimately use in the meantime that we can ultimately then also change into the future that doesn't cause as much bottlenecks into the future, and then fully just understanding that from first principles. But that ultimately comes as a result of asking the right questions, and I'm a big proponent of asking those questions, because simply asking why 5 times allows you to get to the root of what it is that you're actively building and what is aligned to the vision for your business needs as well. But also, all of that comes down to where does the bottom layer of all of this lies, which is ultimately the custom mechanisms, where the leverage points that ultimately come for your specific business. And this means that you're having custom automations, dashboards, alerts, and this is where your business ultimately differentiates itself, because so many other companies can be able to then create somewhat of the same workflow, but ultimately you being able to have these custom animations or these custom dashboards slash alerts as well, this is where you're then able to create that competitive advantage within your specific business needs, and also tying this well with every single thing together, because in as much as everyone can have somewhat of the same tools or somewhat of similar patterns in terms of how they're working, customization is where you're ultimately then going to be able to differentiate even further. And then you're also going to find out into the future that, hey, we have this specific workflow for our email sequences that simply just does not work. If we're using the native what we're given, we need to then automate or create custom automations that ultimately work for our specific business needs, and say that and say through that you're then able to increase 1,000 emails that you're sending per day. Then that ultimately creates that competitive moat that ultimately drives your business a lot further, and ultimately allows you to differentiate it as well. So this is just also how I'm thinking about this, and also integrating this for the specific clients that we're working with as well. So then you might ask the question of, how does this then all work together? And this all works together by identifying the high value business processes first, which is the first starting point. I think asking the questions that ultimately allow you to then identify the high value business processes first. So for example, let's say it's client acquisition. If we then identify that client acquisition is the main proponent for our business, then we're then able to then map out the current tools versus the current future state workflow. Then we're then able to understand how the trajectory of the business is going to be moving into the future. But that also means that we need to make sure that we're detecting points where tools alone don't cut it. So this is where then you're going to have to integrate different custom logic or automations. So for example, you can say, hey, let's use Airtable for now. Let's just use this as our database. But then into the future, we're then going to have to migrate to Retool, because we need a lot more flexibility in terms of the data that we're going to be handling and the tools that we're going to be handling as well. Then we're then able to understand that, hey, we need to make sure that we're detecting the points in which where we can use these off-the-shelf tools, but then there are going to be points as well where we need to integrate custom logic, and we need to have a roadmap for that as well, in terms of understanding that if this happens, then we know how to then best be able to solve for that as well. But then also understanding that we need to make sure that we're building a system that compounds efficiency and not just uses tools but orchestrates them strategically, because I think strategic deployment of these systems or different tools is one of the most important modes that you could build for your business as well. Because simply, if you're then able to build the strategic compounding efficiency, then you're ultimately going to be able to scale, and that is one of the most important modes that I believe is important. And also to think about, I think a business is a living breathing machine, or a baby as some people say it, and this baby needs special attention, it needs care, it needs food, it needs water, it needs all these things in order to survive. And also understand that each baby is different, each baby has different needs, each baby has different things that will ultimately allow it to grow faster or slower, so different nutrients and things of that nature. But ultimately understanding that if we understand the baby at its core, then we're then able to reason up, or basically create the roadmap for it that ultimately allows us to get get this healthy, fit, and best looking baby, if you will, and ultimately creates that competitive advantage. For example, let's say that baby wants to do sports and be the absolute best at sports, then you're then able to nurture it from such a young age and then grow it into this baby that is the number one athlete in the world and the number one person or the number one competing individual. And that is one of the most important things that you could possibly do, and then tying it back to the business as well. And then where this advantage really lives is ultimately is that it doesn't ultimately live in the tools, but it's ultimately in how uniquely your systems operate. So systems plus tools plus custom levers equals competitive advantage that is hard to replicate. And I think one of the most important modes is being hard to replicate, because if your internal systems are super dialed, super clean, and super efficient, then they're hard to replicate. And through that hard to replicate, that is your competitive mode, because the act of mapping simply alone and understanding as well and being able to design your own stack is ultimately the real moat that gives you the competitive advantage to then level up and crush the competition. And I think this is one of the most important ways that I'm actively thinking about this and implementing it for our specific clients, to say, hey, your business has its own needs, it has its own functions, and being able to map out what we need in terms of in its current stage, and also future workflows that we would need into the future, is one of the most important aspects that we also need to be able to cater for into the future. And thinking about this in this specific manner, I know we're then gonna be able to continuously create leverage for the partners that we're actively working with, and as well as our client base as well, because through this I know we're gonna fail so many times, and I've said it countless times, but ultimately we're just gonna keep pushing the needle forward and building this grand vision where we're then able to have this insane amount of impact and inspiring millions of people and redefining industries. But it ultimately starts as a result of the way that we're thinking and laying the foundation for our clients as well, because ultimately creating value for them is the main goal as well in this present moment in time. So yeah, if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. Check out my newsletter that I recently just rolled out. I will be dropping a full article on Sunday, so stay tuned for that. It's going to be super exciting, super detailed, super tactical, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video as well, and I will see you guys in the next video.